Presidential historian Jon Meacham joins us now. Meacham, your thoughts on this moment?
Well, a remarkable American figure. We really don't make them like this anymore. Someone who, as John says, was a political scientist and came to work on the Hill briefly and then goes into the executive branch, youngest White House chief of staff ever. One of the things about, I think, Vice President Cheney that people will be wrestling with, and I think he would love the fact that he's making us wrestle with something. That was part of that. That we get a little half grin, would be the complexities of this legacy. He was an American patriot, and one could, you can already see, can't you, the counterintuitive, the obituaries that are going to be harsh about him because of disagreements over the Iraq War. But he, I think, as Joe just said a minute ago, he called them as he saw them in the service of the nation. He could be wrong, but he wasn't calling them for any other agenda. And I think that there's a kind of theme of patriotism that runs through his life. He clearly gave it, particularly to his daughter in the arena. I remember being on the Hill in, just two quick stories, being on the Hill on the first anniversary of January 6th. And I think I am right to say, the only two Republicans who went to the floor of the House, yeah, that's probably it right there, who went to the floor of the House were Dick Cheney, former member, and Liz Cheney for the commemoration of January 6th. And I remember actually thinking at the time, this is the kind of thing that changes your obituary, because of all the people who were against him through the first decade or so of 21st century, in the end, he did something that very few others in his if any, in his party would do. The other thing, which I have always been deeply impressed by, just on a human level, when I was writing about President George H.W. Bush, he was pretty tough. This was 2010, 2011. He was pretty tough on Vice President Cheney, as Dick Cheney. He said that he thought he was overly harsh. He liked to use the phrase hard ass. He was too hard ass. And I took these comments to Vice President Cheney, and we were sitting in his study there in McLean, and I handed him a transcript of these remarks. Now here, all of us know this world well enough. Here is your former chieftain, the President of the United States, father of the man you served as vice president, saying some pretty tough things about you. Now, we could all pretend we like criticism, but we don't, right? He's reading the document, and the only thing he says is fascinating. Fascinating. And then he handed it back to me and talked about how it was just a different vision of the vice presidency, that President George W. Bush had wanted a stronger vice president. But I'll never forget, a man reading that your former commander-in-chief thinks you're out of bounds and that you've misled his son, right? That you've it was tough stuff. And he just found it fascinating.
Exercising a little restraint, perhaps, too. I'm sure you had some thoughts there, John. Also, in the book you wrote about George H.W. Bush, Destiny and Power, President Bush, 41, said, Dick Cheney always had his own empire. He was always operating his own universe. That could be said of 41 and 43 when Dick Cheney was vice president. Everyone will remember Dick Cheney actually was the one in the White House during the attacks of 9/11. He was the one rushed to the bunker. President Bush was in Florida at a school, of course, and then flying to a couple of different air bases that day. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between Dick Cheney and George W. Bush, 43, because obviously a lot of people accuse Dick Cheney of being the one actually pulling the strings of the government?
Yeah, when I hear that, I always want to say, go spend 4 minutes with George W. Bush and tell me he enjoys being bossed around by anybody.
Yeah.
Right. You know, it doesn't really hold up. Now, I think President Bush was 43, was happy enough to subcontract parts of the government that he didn't want to directly supervise, or thought he had other things to do as well. But George W. Bush did what George W. Bush wanted to do. And agree or disagree, I don't believe the man behind the throne theory. Our friend Peter Baker may disagree about that, but I think, you know, that choice in 2000 is so interesting about almost everybody involved, right? And we all remember this because we're all older now. Willie, I think even you might remember this. So in 2000, George W. Bush is doing everything he can to step away from the shadow of his father, right? He, as W used to say, I inherited all his enemies and half his friends. You know, there was a plus and a minus, right, to it. He desperately wanted to be the Texan, the guy of the then new Republican Party, the evangelicals. You know, the old man was more of a Rockefeller guy, never at home in Texas. And then he chooses the old man Secretary of Defense, affirming, if you wanted a narrative that the old man wanted to have somebody around to keep an eye on him, you know, a chaperone, that President Bush 43, Governor Bush at the time, was willing to take that risk because the guy he'd gotten to know in 2000 when he was running the vice presidential search seemed to him to be a sensible, straight shooting guy. And he was impressed by that. Tiny footnote to American history. You're going to be very sorry you asked me about all this. George W. Bush.
That's actually the thing, John. We didn't ask you about all of this.
All right.
But continue. We want to hear this last point. Go.
Last point. George W. Bush tried to get Dan Quayle moved off the ticket in 1992 for Dick Cheney. He wanted him as vice president. He wanted him as president in the reelect. So all that's interesting enough trivia. The vital point here is that Dick Cheney was a patriot. You could agree with him, you could disagree with him, but he was a man who left a mark, and I would argue that in the end it was a mark, and he bent the arc of the universe toward a fuller understanding of American patriotism.
All right, Jon Meacham, presidential historian, thank you so much for being with us. I am glad he brought up that last point about Dan Quayle, because it just shows if you've been around Washington long enough, there are no permanent friends. There are no permanent enemies. It's a thing I try to say to people early on. Make friends. You disagree with them, that's okay. You're going to need them at some point. Here we have Dick Cheney and Dan Quayle, two people again that the left at certain points in their careers, as with Dr. Brzezinski, loathed. Yep. They were, by the way, they called Dr. Brzezinski Darth Vader before they called Dick Cheney Darth Vader. The left loathed both of these gentlemen, and yet when push came to shove, and actually, I will say, democracy was on the line. It was Dan Quayle that told Mike Pence, you have no choice. You will do what the Constitution tells you to do. You will make sure that Congress makes Joe Biden the next president of the United States. Then you had Dick Cheney on the one-year anniversary of January 6th, one of the darkest days, regardless of the whitewashing of it by people in the right-wing bubble, in the MAGA bubble, one of the darkest days in recent American history.
Yes.
Yeah, Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney being the only two Republicans that showed up on the House floor for the one-year commemoration of an event that the families of 4 police officers believe led to their deaths. And for all of those today who will certainly say, perhaps on the far left and far right, oh, that was nothing. Let me ask, where was every other single Republican in Washington, D.C.? They were all scared to show their faces on that House floor that morning. Dick Cheney and his daughter, though, they were there. And that shouldn't just be sort of brushed aside of like, oh, he just showed up. Because if it were that easy, then hundreds of other Republicans would have shown up that day.
And like you said, they basically stood alone. And I think there's a couple things people might not fully understand about power. Like to get to the place where you're a Cheney, or even by the time Pence is vice president, you have to teach yourself to be unemotional in some ways. You have to teach yourself to be somewhat indifferent to criticism. And you're also operating at the same time in a bubble, right? Like really smart people can make really dumb decisions based on imperfect information. And I think in retrospect, most people would say that's what happened with the Iraq War. I don't think they did it maliciously. I think that there was a set of facts sitting before them. They had to make a really difficult decision. In retrospect, it looked like a terrible decision. But these jobs are very isolated.
Can I just say really quickly, you had the CIA director jumping up and down in the Oval Office saying about Iraq having weapons of mass destruction. It's a slam dunk.
Right.
The CIA director, imagine if they had weapons of mass destruction and a president and vice president had ignored that. I don't say that to wash away anything. I just say that to say you not only had that, you had Iraqi leaders like Chalabi lying through their teeth repeatedly, giving bad information to the U.S. government because they wanted us to invade so they could take power. That was the context of that.
Well, that's also the danger when you put we talk about this a lot on the show, about putting too much power in the hand of one man, right? You need, like one of the things about George W. Bush, whether you liked him or hated him, he had the self-confidence to put really smart people around him. And you could argue about some of the figures, but they were authentically smart, accomplished people. And he really did see himself as a CEO. He really did delegate a lot of that authority so that he had domain expertise so that ultimately he could make good decisions. And essentially, that's what you want in any business. I think it's ultimately what you want in government, because like one person's instincts can be terribly flawed. Even a group's instincts could be terribly flawed. But the more expertise you have around the table, the more people that you're recruiting into government who really understand the topics and are being heard when it comes time for you needing that domain expertise, that's how you ultimately usually get the best possible decisions. And I think that's what George W. Bush did with Dick Cheney. He's like, this is going to look bad for me, but he's a really smart guy. And probably one of my weaknesses is I don't understand the world geopolitical map the way that he does. I want him next to me. And that's history.
All right, coming up.